John Winter, it's good to see you again, my friend.
It's good to see you.
Welcome to everyone in the Sophia audience, meaningoflife.tv, bloggingheads.tv, available on streaming video and audio podcast. I'm here once again with John Winter, also known to us over at the Agora as EJ. John, of course, is one of our core, part of our core stable of writers, writes on a really interesting variety of topics. He and I share, interestingly, despite the fact that we're of different generations, we share a lot of common interests. We did an entire dialogue on punk rock, which is a common love of ours, and which I really enjoyed doing. Today, John, we're going to talk about postmodernism. And the way we're going to talk about it is we're going to talk about your personal experience coming up through an academic PhD program in English, what you saw happening, the changes you saw occurring in terms of how English scholars were pursuing their inquiries, and then you want to disambiguate what happened in English from what you think really postmodern fully understood consists of, and then maybe we'll also talk about it as it's manifesting in philosophy. So does that sound all right to you?
That sounds like a good way to start. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, John, why don't you first of all start with give us a sense of the time period and of your experience when you initially went into an academic doctoral program in English, and maybe start a little earlier than that, because I gather you got a master's degree as well. So tell us the relevant biographical story of you going into academic English, and then tell us about what you saw happening in terms of the entry into that universe of postmodern ideas.
Yeah, I actually didn't. I completed my master's work. I didn't get the degree because it was quite a bit of a blow-up. The master's program was at SUNY Brockport, and SUNY Brockport's English program at that point was fairly conservative and new critical based. Initially, I wanted to do a creative writing thesis that didn't, pan out. I then wanted to do a thesis on Dylan Thomas, who I find a fascinating poet. And I was told, I had completed the thesis, and I was told, Dylan Thomas is not a major poet. So of the 20th century, so you sort of wasted your time.
You were told that by a professor, really?
Yeah. And so I wrote a theoretical piece, defending my reading of Thomas, and what I did not have the chops. I had studied philosophy in bits and pieces in undergraduate school. I'd read a lot of Thomas Aquinas. I started reading Heidegger, but I hadn't really read, philosophy systematically. So I basically came up with an epistemology of reading poetry that was, later I found out, pretty consistent with pragmatist theories. But I didn't know that, and it was really, that got me into the doctoral program at SUNY Albany, where things were very different than the SUNY Brockport. It was primarily at that time trying to transition to a composition theory specialty, and there were a number of Marxists, there were a number of radical feminists. There was one deconstructionist, and there were a number of pragmatists, as well as a number of traditional literaturists.
So hold on there for one second, because I want to be clear about the timeline and get a sense of how the landscape changed. So when you were in the master's program, did I hear you correctly say that it was a program that was largely dominated by the theory of the new critics, i.e. the T.S. Eliot model of... Could you say for a minute what that is? Because people in the audience may not know what that is.
New criticism was developed back in from the turn of the century to 1920s, 1930s, it was a practice of close reading. The initial impulse behind it was to bring the romantic poets into the literary canon, because in the 19th century, they had been kind of banned as atheists and radicals. And initially it was very left leaning, but they did make use of certain understandings of how we read text per se. They had established rhetoric. They had established critical criteria. The big thing about them that I think ended up irking a lot of people by the 1970s was that they kept saying that there was a message to the poem. You were supposed to read the poem. It was, by message, I don't mean that they weren't looking at the poem as a didactic piece, but what they were looking at the poem was as a product of a genius. So, in other words, the poem was coming out of a special intelligence, and the special intelligence, therefore, if it was properly interpreted, by a close reading of the text. In other words, you weren't supposed to look at the whole thing, until you had put the lines together, so to speak. And by reading the lines very carefully individually, you would extract what this intelligence, this inspired intelligence, was actually communicating to the world about, the deeper feelings of life, essentially. Yeah,
and it this also there was a period in aesthetics and philosophy in the mid 20th century which was very new critical in terms of its orientation. I'm thinking about Monroe Beardsley and William Wimsatt had a very famous paper on with an anti-intentionalist paper, and from what I understand, that one of the things about the new critics was that they eschewed both biographical and psychological sort of it was a theory that was supposed to go along with sort of modernist art. Am I wrong about that? I've always associated with T.S. Eliot, and I didn't realize it went back as far as you suggested.
Yeah, it was a modernist literary critical practice.
And how did something that you described originally as leftist come to be so heavily identified with T.S. Eliot, who's exactly the opposite, sort of a leftist? Did it begin politically and then got sort of depoliticized as it became more modernist, or?
Yeah, it eventually became depoliticized, and I think there was a growing concern in the 60s that new literary trends were threatening the tradition, not only the tradition of new critical readings, but the tradition of English literature. Because there was I think I would say the thing that caused caused the new critics the worst palpitation, so to speak, was probably the appearance of the beat poets.
The beat poets.
And what happened in their following.
Yeah.
Beat poets were rowdy, linguistically rowdy, as well as, they're not amenable to the kind of message in the text that I think the new critics were looking for. Yeah. They're pretty overt about what their message is,
Yeah. So now we're at the point to where you enter into the PhD program at Albany, and when is that around?
That's the whole master's to doctorate program, 86 to 90. Like I got the doctorate in 1990, so it was 85 to 90.
And was the new critical focus of your master's program already anachronistic at that point, sort of the last gasp of something, or was that still sort of contested territory at that time?
No, I think at Brockport at the time, I don't think they were aware. I think it was already archaic by that time.
Yeah.
I mean, the major things that I bumped into at SUNY Albany, Marxism, post-Marxism, feminism, radical feminism of one kind or another, Freudian interpretations, Jungian interpretations, so on and so forth. That hadn't happened at Rockford yet.
By post-Marxist, do you mean Frankfurt School or do you mean something else by post-Marxist?
Post-Marxist, by that time, was already Jameson, Frederick Jameson.
Okay.
Frederick Jameson is, as you know, getting a little ahead of ourselves, Frederick Jameson is a major critic of postmodernism because obviously he believes in a Marxist narrative. He just thinks the Marxist narrative has to be kind of rewritten as history goes along because the nature of capital has changed considerably the past 50 years.
So it's not. It's a separate branch from. I always think of the Frankfurt School as sort of the replacement of some of the purely economic dimensions of Marxism with sort of this idea of cultural capital and stuff, and thus it seems sort of obviously amenable to application to arts, right? But I don't know whether what you're talking about now is yet another sort of post-Marxist trend, or is it part of the Frankfurt? Is it an extension of the Frankfurt School?
Post-Marxist theory actually has its roots in Louis Althusser.
Okay.
Who was, as you know, had some mental issues towards the end, but in any event, and Althusser was deeply concerned with the fact that there was a humanistic element, a humanistic narrative in the early Marx texts of Marx and Engels that disappears by the time Marx writes Das Kapital, and that changes the nature of the narrative considerably, so that in the humanistic narrative, it's all about getting the proletariat to a point where they can find happiness, pleasure, self-fulfillment, particularly self-fulfillment, true subjectivity. Whereas if you take the humanistic element out of that by the time you get to Das Kapital, suddenly you're really talking about a socialist machine where everybody's going to find their place. Does that actually produce happiness or true subjectivity? Maybe not anymore.
Gotcha.
It's just another end of history, so to speak. And so so the narrative, the whole idea of the Marxist narrative, and especially in France, really unravels because of the events of 1968, the student rebellion. And let me explain something about that. Because it had enormous impact on French philosophy and theory of the 70s and 80s. The student rebellions were very ideologically pure in terms of where they were taking all the ideas of that now was a time for world revolution and so forth. They thought, for instance, that the Cultural Revolution in China was an indication that, everybody was going to rise up and the world was going to become new. That's always the promise of revolution, right? The world becomes new. So they thought the world was going to become new. And so being ideologically pure Marxists, they assumed that they would go to the labor unions and, chat them up, get them to the barricades. Hey, it's time. This is the time. Well, as a matter of fact, the Communist Party in France at the time was a standard political party. And it was not interested in revolution. It was interested in getting elected. And so the labor unions, were just interested in better wages, better working conditions, and so on and so forth. They were not interested, they were totally cut off from what was happening in Eastern Europe, let alone China. So it was a major disappointment to find that that even the communist parties of France were saying, put down this rebellion, be quiet, and so on and so forth. So it disappointed a lot of people, a lot of academics, not just students, but professors who were involved in this, and they had to end up rethinking what it meant, what Marx meant, in a sense, what the Marxist narrative meant, because clearly something had gone wrong with the story. And so you have a lot of, Althusser is the main example because he remained Marxist. But you had a lot of Marxists, French Marxists, who say, I don't want to do this anymore, like Foucault, like Derrida, like Baudrillard, and they begin unraveling the narrative structure, so to speak, of not only of Marxism, but of modernity itself, of modernity's literature. And that's, I think there's a fundamental difference between post-structuralism, Derrida, Foucault, for instance, and postmodernism, even postmodernist theories like Baudrillard or Lyotard, because in many ways, post-structuralism is still a way to try to keep alive the dialogue of modernity, whereas postmodernism is saying that that dialogue is over. All right, so I'm sort of really getting ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah, but this is very interesting. You're painting such interesting landscapes, and it just keeps raising so many interesting questions, so I don't mind that we bounce around a little bit. One of the things I want to ask you about, what you just described them in France, with the sort of the disappointment when the student activists found out that labor was not interested in what they were doing. I mean, there was, again, obviously a very similar thing happened in the U.S. I mean, and that's the point at which the Democratic Party and the left wing in the United States experienced this split, because traditionally, but here, what I wanted to ask you was, in the United States, part of the reason for the estrangement of labor from the student left was because labor actually tended to be somewhat culturally conservative, right? And they weren't interested in the hippies and all the foreigners. And I always used to say that, if Archie Bunker had been 30 years earlier, he would have been a Democrat, and obviously would have been a Democrat, right? And so was there a similar dynamic in Europe, namely that there was also a sort of cultural alienation of labor from the students, right? Because of the class differences, cultural differences, or was it a very different story of why labor and the left split?
That's one of the reasons there was a difference, and that's one of the reasons why trying to make comparisons. Occasionally in our political debates, we talk about socialist governments of Europe and whether they're successes or failures. We're missing one of the basic points, which is that socialism was never demonized in Europe. I mean, in fact, part of what's going on in Europe before World War II and into World War II is that a lot of people in Europe thought there were only two choices: some form of Marxist socialism, some form of fascism. There was no middle ground in Europe before the war, which obviously is not true here. And not only is that not true here, consequently, it's possible to be in a labor union and also to have fairly right-wing ideas, because it's not, we don't make that kind of distinction here. And also in terms of cultural differences, there are similarities between France in 1968 and the United States in 1969, but there are also an awful lot of differences. The Cultural Revolution in the United States, took 5-10 years, right? I mean, it was a very gradual process. It involved all kinds of, people didn't think too much about class. I don't remember people thinking too much about social class. We were aware that there were rich people. We were aware that there were poor people. We were aware that there were black people. We were aware that there were white people. But, a lot of class and ethnic distinctions didn't really, let's take the ethnic distinction, the race issue. It starts off with a bang in the early 60s, and it ends with a bang with the rise of black nationalism in the late 60s. But for about 3 or 4 years, everybody's dancing James Brown. It's people are not thinking a lot about the kinds of class distinctions that make up political dialectics at the height of the Cultural Revolution. It's really about Vietnam, primarily about Vietnam, and about party.
Yeah, and I guess also about life and about lifestyle, right? I mean, the hippie were in many ways a lifestyle revolution. Yeah.
Not a political party, but about party, man.
Yeah.
And so that had no. There was nothing like that in Europe, as I understand it. There were, fairly traditional social gatherings, and that took some interesting, developed some interesting innovations, like the original skinheads in England, for instance, were actually working class kids who hung out with Jamaicans.
Interesting. Interesting.
So there were some innovations, but there were no Woodstock. There was no Woodstock in Isle of Wight. I think it's 1970. It's not Woodstock.
It's not the same phenomenon. Yeah, no, that's right. It's the same bands, but it doesn't have the same. Doesn't play the same cultural role. No, that's very interesting. Okay, so you're in you start graduate school. You finished what you said was already an archaic and anachronistic program. You walk into this PhD program in Albany. So now tell us a little story about your experiences there, what you saw happening, and maybe that will lead us to you talking to us about what you see as the differences between post-structuralism and postmodernism.
Okay. The radical theorists in SUNY Albany, who would not be considered too radical today, but they were basically former political radicals of the 60s who had found their niche in academia, and they were actually quite good as scholars and critics. They hadn't yet abandoned new criticism per se as a model of practice. But they had a definite idea, which, I think it'll probably come up later again because it's fundamentally wrong, which is that if you can control the academy, you can control where the society is going through new teaching methods, by teaching from alternative and sometimes radical points of view, and that there was some real social power in the academy that was worth fighting for. All right, and this, I'm sure this is probably sounding authentic to you, who has to deal with some of this even today, especially in the problems you see in the APA and the rise of transgender activism. That there's some sense that there's some locus of power in the academy that has to be claimed. All right. And that created a lot of tensions at SUNY Albany that I remember. And I will, it had an interesting effect for me. I ran afoul of the radical feminists at SUNY Albany. And it was largely over a book. It was The Color Purple, which frankly I don't think is a very good book.
But the book was ubiquitous. I mean, a very famous book, and very mainstream in the sense that it was in the mainstream culture, right? I mean, they made a major film out of it. Right. So what happened with that book?
I didn't like the book.
You didn't like the book? Okay, well that's allowed. Isn't that allowed?
I had a criticism. I said this is ahistorical. This is because Alice Walker distorts historical fact and the historical experience, which you can actually hear and read that historical experience. You can hear it in the blues and in the jazz of the 20s and 30s. You can read about it in poetry that was written back then by African Americans, and what Alice Walker writes is simply not true to that historical experience. And
in what sense, particularly?
The novel ends, if I remember correctly, the novel ends with everybody hugging everybody and everything's all right with the world again, or something like that. I can't remember, but the trajectory of these characters' narratives is just not really what is true to that experience. From my understanding of African American culture of that, and appreciation of African American culture of that period, it was a rough life, much rougher life than she depicted. Anyway, so I said these things, and that was becoming an important book for feminists, radical feminists.
Why?
There's a lesbian relationship in the novel.
That's what I was wondering. I mean, is that what they were sort of planting their flag on? Was it, well, that wasn't the dimension of it that you were criticizing, though, was it?
No. There was homosexuality in the black communities in the 1920s and 30s, but it didn't, my understanding, and it did not play out the way it plays out in that novel. It's meant to it's meant to, I don't know, it's been years since I read that novel, literally 30 years, so I really shouldn't talk too much about the novel itself. But I just remember it was sugar-coated history. I pointed that out, and because that's what they wanted. A number of radical feminist literary critics, not only at SUNY Albany, but in major journals and newspapers, that's what they wanted. They wanted the sugar-coated history. They wanted another version of history that got them to where they could feel comfortable in the culture. And while I understand the need to feel comfortable in the culture, I think there's a healthy way to get to that point and an unhealthy way to get to that point. And certainly you revise history if you have new evidence. That's when you revise history. You don't revise history by creating evidence. You know what I mean? That's the wrong way to revise history. That gets you a false narrative and false expectations and a false sense of reality. So anyway, so I ran afoul of the radical feminists at SUNY Albany, and fortunately, I chose, because I was becoming more interested in, and I guess this had to do with my previous reading of Heidegger. I was becoming more interested in post-structuralism and Derrida and Possmann, and one of Possmann's former students was actually SUNY Albany, and I became her teaching assistant, and she was a wonderful teacher. Her name was Helen Elam, and she was from Argentina, and she was a post-structuralist feminist. So once she took me under her wing, I was kind of safe. So I owe her a lot. Frankly, I think I owe her my ability to complete that doctorate.
Could you say a little bit about, just quickly, what it was that you found appealing and interesting about post-structuralism, and by way of that, giving some people in the audience a sense of what post-structuralism is?
Okay, well, structuralism.
That's Saussure, right? That's sort of like formalized linguistics, right?
Saussure was a Swiss linguist who did a lecture in semiology, and semiology is a competes with Peircean semiotics, because it's for Saussure, signs are binary. You have a lang, which is a system, and you call, for instance, you have English, you have French, you have German. These are all langs, right? There are systems, they complete with grammars, dictionaries, and so forth. And then you have parole. Parole is temporally contingent. It can include slang, it can include new formations of grammar, it can include writings, it can include newspaper reports. And when you run that through certain anthropological and linguistic theories, you come up with structuralism, which is that you're looking for the structures of the not only in terms of language, but also in terms of stories we tell, in terms of images, in terms of symbology, and all of these will have structures, and the structures will be the key. You're trying to, dig your way through the parole to get to the lang, so to speak.
Gotcha.
And the next major figure in structuralism is an anthropologist and linguist by the name of Levi-Strauss. And he was like the big figure in the French Academy for about 20 years. And the phrase structuralism is actually coined in respect to the work of Levi-Strauss, at least in France. And what post-structuralism did, remember after the events of '68, the French theorists had to say, one of the narratives, the big narratives of history, right, for them in '68 was Marx. Some form of Marxism, might have been Stalinism, might have been Maoism, but with some Trotskyism, whatever. It was some form of Marxism. And there's the structure. It seemed to have been working fine. The parole matters, for instance, the minor dictatorships in various Eastern European countries weren't really, they were historically contingent, they had to happen, but, we're moving towards this grand future. Suddenly it's clear we're not moving to that grand future anymore. So what you have is an analysis, first, of Marxism itself, and second of all, of modernity, because Marxism is one of the major meta-narratives of modernism, right? It's you have Hegelianism, you have Marxism, you have the story of the rise of the liberal state and liberal democracies. You have various national meta-narratives of how America becomes the great manifest destiny, so on and so forth. And Marxism is one of these great meta-narratives. So you start having to deal with not only the failure of Marxism, but in a sense the failure, or something's going wrong with modernity. Something is not happening. All these narratives are going wrong somehow. And that's what post-structuralism is. It's an analysis of how modernity fails itself. And that can be in terms of textual readings. It can be in terms of metaphysics. It can be in terms of social identity, social ontologies. That's why Foucault comes up with his genealogical method, trying to find out where ideas come from, in modernity. And but it's all about, it's called post-structuralism because it's kind of unraveling of the meta-narrative. And it goes back to Heidegger, which is why it's easy to become interested in post-structuralism if you have a reading history in Heidegger. Because Heidegger has two moments as a philosopher, as we all know, having to do with his stupid affair with Nazism. And there's the Heidegger before Nazism, who is a brilliant scholar, one of the great readers of Kant and Hegel. And there's the Heidegger after his disappointment with Nazism, who becomes, he passes through a period where he has to separate himself from Nietzsche. And so he gives a massive lecture against Nietzsche around, I think it was 1943. And then there's finally the post-war Heidegger, who really is not interested in doing traditional scholarly philosophy and says, that whole jig is up. But what they all share, all these Heideggers share is a sense that there's a hidden story beneath the story of Western philosophy. And the hidden story is that philosophy is always looking for God. And consequently, when it talks about its existence, it is always talking about where the divine is without talking about where the divine is. It's basically blinded to itself. And so that's why the word deconstruction actually comes out of an expression of Heidegger's where he says, if we're going to get back to what philosophy was really about with the ancient Greeks, we have to destroy the history of Western metaphysics. It doesn't mean about burning books. It means unraveling all these narrative, tanglements that have been dumped onto whatever that was that the ancient Greeks, knew when they experienced, the world around them.
Was his notion basically that the Enlightenment, in a sense, represented the wrong way of developing beyond the ancient and medieval philosophy? In other words, does he associate this wrong turn that now has to all be undermined with the Enlightenment? Because then that would explain why it's anti-modern, right? I mean, because the Enlightenment is where modernity comes from, right? I mean, that's with its individualism and with all these other sort of elements to it. Is that his main beef? Is that the Enlightenment kind of misunderstood its predecessors and thus took philosophy sort of in the wrong direction?
Well, for Heidegger, the Enlightenment, like I say, is blind to itself. It thinks it is doing epistemology. It's actually doing a kind of ontology. And the ontology it's doing is an ontology of it calls it ontotheology because it's an ontology of the human spirit as divinity. He's not too far wrong if you read the German idealists, which he had enormous admiration for, not just Hegel, but Fichte and Schelling. They're coming very close to saying man is God.
Yeah.
And that what philosophy is about the human spirit realizing itself as being the most powerful, the most knowing of beings. So he's not too far wrong. But I think that if that's the case, to get back to some basic encounter with the world around you, which is what he's talking about, in terms of confronting being, you would have to set aside this sense of human divinity somehow. And I think, after he, attacks Nietzsche and separates himself from the Nazis, his primary move is into reading poetry and saying, the poets are doing this. Philosophers are not doing this, poets are doing this. So he does, in terms of moving our narrative along, he is preparing the ground for, the post-structuralists are not looking for ancient Greece. They're not looking for a true experience encounter with the world. In fact, they say, you can't do that. The whole notion that, Derrida or Foucault or Heideggerians is misguided because they think Heidegger is wrong to think that you can have this primal experience with the world. You can't. Everything is going to be mediated by language and signs. And consequently, what their unraveling of the narrative is really an unraveling not to get somewhere, but simply an unraveling to achieve greater awareness, a certain ironical stance, to experience better understanding of how linguistic practices operate not only in the immediate present, but more importantly in history, because history is always going to be suspect for them.
So they share, let me just get this straight, they take on board sort of the negative dimension of Heidegger, but not the positive dimension of Heidegger.
Yes.
Because if you said Heidegger was contra Nietzsche,
yeah.
But of course, then you also said that the post-structuralists, return to the sort of the genealogical approach precisely because it represents things as sort of being historically contingent in a way that gets you away from any sort of engagement with eternals, you know what I mean? With sort of, and I guess Heidegger was all about getting back to engagement with eternals, right? Okay, that makes it kind of interesting. That's interesting. Okay, so now bring this back to how you saw this playing all out. You're in the PhD program at Albany, and you're seeing all this play out. How does this play out, particularly in English?
Well, the way it played out is that with Marxism crumbling into post-Marxism, with radical feminism trying to rewrite the canon of literature, with the rise of Afrocentrism, which was really, I think Henry Louis Gates is a brilliant writer. I've met him. He's a nice guy. But there was a strand, and what he had to say, for instance, in Signifying Monkeys is, I think, pretty good. But there was a strand of Afrocentrism that was just way off the wall that basically said, Plato actually came from Africa. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, remember there was a fight about this in the 90s. Wasn't there a book by, was it Mark Bernal? Is it Black Athena? And then there was a big, huge fight about this. I remember this in the 90s when I was in my graduate program. Was it Martin Bernal who wrote Black Athena? Who was arguing that the Greeks were black and then that
the book we had to read in SUNY Albany, because we had assigned books, and the book we had to read on Afrocentrism, I can't remember the guy's name. It was one of these names that was clearly an invented African name, which is, I don't know where this guy is, but it was a silly book. It was about basically the argument that Plato was getting all of his ideas from African.
Yeah. That we had that conversation in philosophy as well, and I just looked it up. The book was called Black Athena, and the argument was essentially that the roots of classical antiquity were actually black. So yes. So that happens in English also, I guess. Yeah, that's interesting.
And it happened earlier. Basically, everything you guys went through in the 90s, we went through in the 80s.
Gotcha.
But I'm laughing. I should say, I think there's a great deal of wisdom that one can derive from various African cultures. You're just not going to get Plato out of it because he's not. And the claim that he was, or that he was, took a voyage to Nairobi, to become Plato. That's a falsification of history. That's revisionism.
Yeah.
It does nobody any good. It doesn't do African history any good to do that.
Yeah. So you're in the English program, and all this is sort of churning around you, and I gather it created internally somewhat of a hostile environment for people who really weren't on board with this, right? Did it create divisions within the program, amongst the faculty, amongst the students?
There was some tensions on occasion. I don't think it was, because there were still some traditional literaturists there. There were a number of very interesting poets. And there were, I'd say, a couple of pragmatist composition theorists. So you, again, in a graduate degree, you try to find people you can hang with.
Yeah.
It's only in the required courses, where things get tense. The Afrocentrist book was in a required course. The Color Purple was in a required course. And that's where things get tense, because that's where you have to confront, everybody has to read this book, or they have to discuss this issue, and then you're going to have different opinions. And unfortunately, the Academy doesn't really handle differences of opinions very well, in my experience.
Which is a bitter irony, right? I mean, that's sort of it's what you would not expect, right? Yeah. Given the nature of the enterprise, right? You would not expect it to be that way. It's interesting, though. It sounds to me like one thing you're saying, though, is that actually things today are much worse, because today those divisions lead to people trying to, deprive up their enemies of their livelihoods. I mean, it's become existential now. You have purges. I mean, it's what you're describing doesn't sound as bad as that, right?
Well, apparently it got worse. About 5 years after I got my doctorate, I bumped into one of my professors, and he said that the year after I got my doctorate, the feminists had finally taken control of the hiring process, and had hired younger, even more radical feminists. And apparently, he reported an instance where the younger radical feminists were chasing the older radical feminists literally in the hallways, saying, "You're a traitor, you're a dinosaur. Why don't you move on?"
Wow, I mean that's like a direct anticipation of the current turf wars, right? I mean that's exactly what's happening now. The newer wave feminists who are all into trans and gender identity activism are basically accusing the traditional feminists, the older generations, of being no better than like Trumpers, right? I mean, it's interesting. It seems like, as you say, everything that happened in philosophy is happening in philosophy happened in English first. The English was sort of the canary in the coal mine. It sounds to me like if you'd been in 10 years later, you would not have made it through. I mean, you would have been would have been canceled, as they say now, right?
You mean if I had gotten attempted my doctorate in around 2000? Yeah, I don't think I would have gotten it, and I'm not sure I would have.
You would have wanted it.
Yeah, at that point. And one of the interesting things about English, and this actually does have to do with postmodernism in general, is that frankly, the English literary studies have pretty much no reason to exist anymore.
You got to say a little more about that. Why?
English literary studies was there, as one of my professors, Don Burt, said, it was there to protect the archive, what he called the archive, what most people know as the canon. It's better to think of it as an archive. It's basically, a collection of major language events in English history, major imaginative language events, not speeches, but poems and plays and so on. So they're imaginative language events, which means that the people making these texts, have some creative control over the language, over literally over the grammar, word choices, word inventions, and so on and so forth. And these propel the language in its development, in its evolution. And that's absolutely important if you're going to know the history of English-speaking nations, to know how things sounded differently 200 years ago, and how ideas were framed differently 200 years ago, or 400 years ago, or whatever. And what happened in the 80s, one of the unfortunate, and it was already beginning, I mean, it actually has its roots in the 1920s, 1930s, when the academic critics started asking the question whether Ernest Hemingway was not a living classic. I mean, he was incredibly popular among academic literaturists in the 1920s and 30s. And they raised the question, can you have a contemporary classic? The answer, by the way, is no, you cannot. Ontologically impossible. You know, if there is a book that is a classic, the author has to be dead. I'm sorry. But, you know, today we're always talking about the instant classic. And by the late 1980s, English professors were expected to teach contemporary literature courses. And by the end of my graduate program, it wasn't simply that they were expected to teach contemporary literature, but they were going to be taught, contemporary literature was going to be taught as if they were classics, which means that they were classics, which means that they were in the canon, and now the canon is all over the place, right? Includes whatever some professor is writing about, even though it may be a short story by some high school student in Nebraska. It's part of the canon. It's gotten an essay about it in some journal.
Yeah.
And so that means the canon is done.
Excuse me.
The archive is not, it's fallen apart. It's people are not keeping records on the archive anymore.
Yeah. So let me just you said something at the beginning that I want to sort of have to, as the end, so that we can sort of, this thing has the shape that I think it's taken, and that is, you said that, and I think you said this in a way that implied that this was a mistake, right? that there was this impression that it was important to control the academy because controlling the academy was going to give you direct sort of access to sort of controlling the culture, right? The development of the society and the culture.
Yeah.
And you also said to me when we were speaking prior to the recording that you think that this mistake is related to why you don't really think that postmodernism comes out of the academy, and that postmodernism should be disambiguated from post-structuralism. So
right.
maybe we could sort of, as we're sort of winding down, you could sort of complete that tale that you started at the beginning by going through these connections.
It's very easy, and I talked to a friend of mine this week about these ideas, and I said, the postmodernism or postmodernity that we almost never talk about is the one they actually live in. And immediately, it's very easy. He immediately talks about his experiences with certain professors, and it's very easy to discuss postmodernism or postmodernity within the academy because the outlines seem to be clear between a certain kind of radical relativism versus a certain objectivity, whether truth exists or not as a theoretical principle that is attainable, so on, how we read science sociologically rather than scientifically, blah, 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 blah. That's not really the interesting postmodernity. That's because, that has to do ultimately with whether the academy will survive or how it will survive. And that is important. And that has serious social consequences. But the problem is that postmodernity is all around us. We are, I was thinking about this in terms of how modernity developed as an idea. I think one of the earliest mentions of modernity that I can recall is actually a satire by Jonathan Swift, Battle of Books. And the argument there, which took place in the late 1700s, was actually a mirror image of a real argument between literary scholars of the time, because already in late 17th century, they're developing literary scholarship that should be set alarm bells off because that didn't happen before then. Anyway, so the argument was between those who held that the classics, the ancients, literally the Greeks and the Romans, had greater experience with nature and could with their language relate better than the moderns who were somehow set apart from direct experience with nature, and consequently were developing, languages that were actually distancing us from experience, right?
Interesting.
And the interesting thing is, I asked myself the question. So Swift is using language which is in common play at the time, talking about moderns and ancients, but he's not yet saying that the moderns are modernists, or that this is the modern era. So I'm asking myself, well, when did that become possible? At what point in history that you could have walked around London or New York City or Paris and say, this is the modern era, And I think it was probably, I have a suspicion it was probably the early 19th century, around the time of the Napoleonic Wars or their immediate aftermath. That there was a sense that, a sense had developed largely because there were not only how philosophy and science were structured, but how the institutions surrounding philosophy and science were getting structured. That there was a sense that this is what happened before the French Revolution, what happened before the 18th century, what happened before the Enlightenment, that's done. And this is the modern world.
And what's the relationship in your mind between the modern and modernism?
I think modernism is a narrative of the progress of the modern. In other words, modernism is saying, okay, this is as far as we've come. How can we go farther, right?
And that's not primarily academic, you don't think?
I don't think it was in the 19th century. In the 19th century, modernists, the great modernists of the 19th century were the railroad men. People who put railroads between the two coasts in America. They're the modernists, and they knew it. They knew they were doing something new, and they were going to profit off of it quite a bit. But in other words, the modernists of the 19th century were the industrialists. You didn't have to be in the academy for that. In fact, the academy was extremely conservative. Right.
Right. That makes sense. I guess maybe I was thinking of the arts as an extension of the academy, but I guess that's a mistake, right? That's when I hear modernist, the first thing I think of is like Kandinsky, right, or something, right? And maybe literature, Faulkner or Joyce or Kafka, right? In terms of these sort of stylistic, tremendously innovative stylistics. But it sounds to me like you're telling a different story about these things.
No, it's not that far off, because they're not in the academy.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, yeah, no.
I think it was I can't remember who it is now. Who wrote the Flowers of Evil? Fleur de Mal.
Flowers of Evil?
Yeah.
I'm looking it up right now.
I can't remember who it is, but he was actually something.
You're talking about Baudelaire. Baudelaire, yeah.
And he was an art critic, and he would actually paint his hair green and hang out at the coffee shop. So he was not in the academy. And I think that they were, the artists of the time were very aware that they were in the modern period. I think they saw themselves as being somehow related to the industrialists, that they were bringing in, the world. The academy itself was very, actually very old and crusty.
No, you're absolutely right. And so so what you want to say then is sort of, well, look, the modern was not primarily an academic movement. If anything, academic modernists were sort of late to the party, right? And similarly, postmodernism doesn't come out of can you tell a similar story where postmodernism doesn't come out of post-structuralism? In other words, were the academic post-structuralists also late to the party, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, actually, the first theorists of postmodernity, who did not actually, I did want to break this up. The first theorist of postmodernity who did not use that term, but is clearly headed in that direction, is Marshall McLuhan. Understanding media is the first attempt to analyze postmodern culture.
And that you could call that academic, but it isn't really, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, it is because someone might say, "Well, wait a minute, isn't that academic?"
Yeah, it is academic, which tells us that, in fact, the culture is already moving towards postmodernity by the time somebody in the academy can even look at it out of the corner of their eye, which is what McLuhan is doing. He's seeing it out of the corner of his eye. He doesn't even have a word for it yet, but it is.
What year is McLuhan?
66. Around, I believe.
What year is Warhol?
Warhol is 64.
Okay, so that tracks then, right? So in other words, because Warhol, if you ask me about what's in non-academic, what's postmodern, I would say, Brillo boxes,
right?
Right? And that's pre McLuhan, right? Interesting. Yeah. So where would you say are the earliest non-academic signs of the postmodern? Would you say it's Warhol, or would you say it's somewhere else?
I think I have a funny answer to that. Rodin, the sculptor, designed a very famous sculpture called The Kiss, which is a tall man and a woman sitting on the guy's lap. They're about to kiss. He's got his hand on her knee. What I found out recently is that he actually licensed the duplication of that sculpture in bronze to a foundry in Germany that made, I think, 17 copies distributed to different museums across the world.
Interesting.
And they're all labeled Rodin's Kiss, even though they're in bronze, whereas his work was, I believe, in marble. And because of the nature of the bronzing process, the shoulders are angular rather than curved. In other words, you suddenly have this appearance of a legitimate copy that is not the original.
And were those machine-made or handmade?
Machine-made. There was actually, someone was given the rights by hand in England, and it was not completed. But the duplicates were actually from a foundry. So
Rodin anticipated Warhol, in a sense.
What?
You could say Rodin anticipated Warhol.
Right. I think there were but machines were very much involved in the process.
Wow. I had no idea. That's fascinating.
And that's really, so that's the 1890s. Postmodernism is not, modernity, all these periodizations, Middle Ages, the Renaissance, Reformation, modern, postmodern, the Enlightenment, the Romantic, they misguide us into thinking that there are these blocks of time, and that you enter a block of time and suddenly you're in the modern, or you enter a block of time and suddenly you're in the postmodern. That's not the case. Obviously there's profound overlap, and there's going to be themes that run concurrent throughout. And actually, come to think of it, I think that it just hit me. That's probably the best way to think about history nowadays. That what you're trying to find are themes. You're not trying to find narratives. You will tell a story if you do history. You will, because that's the nature of writing history. But I think the real issue is themes, because the narratives have largely fallen apart.
I don't know how familiar you are with Arthur Danto. But his whole end of art history thesis sounds a lot like what you're talking about here in a microcosm. His is in a microcosm, yours in and that is in the sense that it's almost fair to say that history for a while was a series of was narrational, and sort of one of the things that sort of characterizes postmodernity is that it ceased being narrational at a certain point. I'm wondering what do you think is the main or a main cause of that? Is it modern communications?
I think that modern communications has a lot to do with it. I think there's a number of things going on, because I think that is a major part of it. The world of YouTube, for instance. So we just mentioned Marshall McLuhan, right, and his understanding of how television was going to be the cool medium that people could participate in, which, for 30 years looked stupid. You had three major broadcasting networks, right? You couldn't talk to them. Now, of course, on the other hand, we have YouTube, and everybody is participating in television, right? So he was pretty much on the money. The problem is that actually doesn't bring us any closer, because as it turns out, you can put anything on YouTube. There's no way to verify what is interest. Not only no way to verify what's true or not often, but also there's no way to verify what's interesting or not. You click on it and say, oh, well, this looks like it might be interesting. All right, well, it's not interesting to me, but it might be interesting to my friends. I better watch this. You don't know. And your friends are all on YouTube too. So eventually the point is that the whole sense of what becomes important dissolves or is left unresolved, let's put it that way.
And isn't there just an inherently atomizing and fracturing effect of just the overwhelming plenitude that comes with communications that now occur in sort of virtual space?
Yeah.
I mean, Susan Sontag worried about that a lot. I think she was also much more prophetic than people gave her credit for. I'm just finding some of her landmark pieces more and more relevant today. And as McLuhan seems to be getting more and more relevant today. So how would you then describe at this point, and maybe we'll finish on this since we're going over the hour, how would you describe at this point the relationship between postmodernity in the world and postmodernity in the academy? I mean, is postmodernity in the academy still essentially post-structuralist, or has it moved beyond that to something else?
I think that in terms of the academy, you always have to separate, like the radical sociologists of science who say science is all power and politics and so on. You have to separate that kind of postmodernism from people who are analyzing postmodernity. And, my three favorites when I was in my graduate program were Lyotard, who I think is a brilliant philosopher, Baudrillard, who's entertaining sociologist, and Sloterdijk, whose critique of cynical reasoning is a meditation on how this kind of begins actually in the 30s.
Who was the last one? Could you say the name again?
Peter Sloterdijk.
Oh, okay.
The Reason was the book that I read at the time. And, there's also the way that Danto is interesting. I just read Bernard Williams' Truth and Truthfulness, which I think is wrestling with this issue, especially in the second half where he deals quite explicitly with the problems of history, the need to have some truthfulness in historical narrative, even when the narrative is spotty. So we have to separate. There are academics who analyze postmodern that we need actually to pay attention to and not lump all together as, all these relativists. The postmodern is here. Postmodern is YouTube. YouTube. The postmodern is the way people dress these days. The postmodern is, I brought this up on a number of comments because you had written an interesting article at Electric Agora about kitsch and the liberal state. How
about kitsch, yeah.
Threatens the liberal state, and the kitsch is, part of what happens in postmodernity is that kitsch replaces culture.
Culture becomes kitsch, right? In a sense, I mean, it's one of the legacies of postmodernity is sort of the kitchification of almost everything, right? Which I lamented, but I guess you're sort of saying that that's just unavoidable, right? I mean,
it is. The older you are, I think the more nostalgic one is about when things were modern.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Modernism had an understanding that somehow you could get into the same narrative as other people. I was going to mention as an example of that a book called Giants in the Earth by Rolveg, a Norwegian American. And it's about a Norwegian family that immigrates to America. And the idea this is in the 1880s, and the idea is that the family has is that they're going to make their money because America's a rich land and, farm, they're going to own hundreds of acres eventually. And once they make their money, they're going to go back to Norway. And of course, what happens is that they're in South Dakota and they have forgotten to take into account South Dakota weather, and so they go through some miserable periods. And ultimately, they realize that they ain't going back to Norway.
Right.
And initially, when they think they're going back to Norway, they try to keep their kids away from American kids, non-Norwegian kids, train them in the Norwegian tradition, so on and so forth. But when they realize that they're not going to go back to Norway, they send them to school and say, learn to be an American, right? And that's, for me, that is paradigmatic of the immigrant experience. Certainly it was for both my grandparent families.
My parents as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's modernity. We are somehow all going to get on the same page. In post-modernity, that's not going to happen. We're not always on the same page. We're not ever going to get on the same page with some people. And it's easy to be nostalgic for that modernist moment, consequently, because the modernists hoped that we were all going to tell the same story or chapters in shared stories. Whereas now, you look at some people, you have no idea where they're coming from or what they're thinking or what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that sort of fragmentation is an inevitable outcome of media communications occurring in a virtual space. And I've talked at the Electric Agora and other places about just at the level of popular culture, the sort of the socially disintegrating effects of it no longer being the case that there's anything like 150 million people in the country watching the last episode of MASH, right? I mean, there's just everything is too broken up. And I guess the last thing I want to ask you, because it just occurred to me, but this is so interesting. This idea of thinking of the modern as representing the last point at which we could credibly think of ourselves as part of an ongoing narrative, and the postmodern is that of sort of being the fundamental fragmentation or disintegration of the narratives. I wonder if this provides an entirely different lens, and in some ways a very apolitical lens, to understanding the current populist movements. There is a kind of, to me, reminds me of, and they're even calling it kind of like a new nationalism, right? And I'm wondering whether, to me, there's something almost romantic about it, in that I'm wondering whether we underestimated just how disturbing the fragmentation of narrative was going to be to so many people, and that they were going to do anything they could to try to get us back on a narrative, right? Do you think that there's anything to that, or do you think that the current political populist waves across the country have to be explained in a much more local contingent sort of way?
No, well, here's the problem, though, because we have to remember that this fragmentation isn't simply coming out of the arts. It comes out of a number of different places. What we have to really look at is this distribution. And what I mean by that is that this fragmentation sells. The fragmentation creates markets, and what I'm saying is that, look at an aspect of right-wing nationalism, which is, of course, guns rights. The gun industry makes an awful lot of money, and so does the NRA. So the fragmentation is something that actually has a profit motive involved in it, and advertisers love it. They just love it. They get to advertise to different populations in different ways. Same old crap. Sell the same old crap to different people in different ways. That was recognizable back in the 60s. They finally realized that if they slapped paisley and flowers on something, they could sell. They could sell a notebook to a hippie, and if they took off the paisley and flowers and had just a regular black and white binding, they could sell it to a conservative. See what I'm saying? I mean, it sells. Right? It sells.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds to me like it's almost as if capitalism is the only thing that is the only sort of force that is perfectly happy for the narratives to be over and to have them be fragmented and people sort of spread out all across the landscape. And I guess there is a sense in which the yearnings of those who are falling for these sort of modern nationalist movements is manipulative, right? They're being manipulated. But I do think that maybe we underestimate how uncomfortable living in a postmodern environment is for a lot of people, right?
I think
that's a fair discomfort. I think it's fair. I find it uncomfortable, unappealing. I'm just not tempted by romantic fantasies to the extent to which maybe other people are. But I share the discomfort. And you think maybe we underestimate a little bit and underappreciate that the discomfort is.
No, the discomfort is real. I think we are in a postmodern moment. I don't know where that's going to come about. I also am defensive of postmodern analysts who tend to get lumped into the relativists, without justification.
I like that distinction you made within the academy between the people who are simply trying to understand what's happening, and what's happening is postmodern.
Right.
And the people who are kind of almost activists for increasing postmodernism, right? I mean, I think that's a very important distinction.
And when I defend this, I say, I'm not happy with this situation. Just because I say this is the postmodern moment doesn't mean I'm saying, hey, it's the postmodern moment.
Right.
I'm saying this is the postmodern moment. What do we do? How do we live with it? What comes next, if anything? And I'm not sure that I did want to say one last thing.
Please go ahead.
I think this is really important. Postmodernism is called, I think it's the first time in history when a major historical moment is a post something. Nobody's thought of the Enlightenment as post-Christian. It was just the Enlightenment. And I think the reason why my fear is that I look around not only in literature, philosophy, various humanities and social sciences, but also even in the hard sciences. I wonder if the West is not at this point exhausted intellectually. So the question, in other words, I'm not sure that we can. When Danto talks about the end of art and relates it to Hegel's theory of the end of history, the end of history does not. For Hegel, the end of history means you arrive at the blessed point where all the good stuff in history comes together, and you don't have to have history anymore because you're living in this, the ideal state. Actually, what happens, I think, is that the end of a historical narrative is a point of exhaustion, where it's no longer possible to come up with a workable new theory, a new idea, new innovation.
And so what needs to happen is that new narrative histories need to arise from emerging societies.
Yeah, there has to be some sense of, otherwise, there has to be some sense that something else will happen so that we can get beyond post-modernity and not into something called post-postmodernity, which was a theory that somebody came up with 10 years ago. It's ridiculous. That's not what we need. We need to actually, because, we won't see it when it happens, which is interesting. The same way that we didn't see post-modernity happen with Andy Warhol or Marshall McLuhan. And the modernists didn't see that the battle books that Swift was writing about, they didn't see that was actually going to somehow determine the nomenclature for the age that they were going to live in. We're not going to see the next era happening. We're not going to be able to call it what it is. We don't know yet what the signs of it is. But yeah, it has to be something, some innovation that heals a lot of. I don't know exactly.
But I don't think it can come out of us. I mean, it seems to me that this is going to come out of the countries that are out of the societies that are now industrializing, right? I mean and in other words, I don't think there can be, both conceptually and as a matter of just looking around, I don't think there is anything postmodern, right? I mean, in a sense, that's the end, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the only thing that sort of, if you think about it, there's no intrinsic reason to think that a civilization has an endless life, right? I mean, and I mean in terms of its intellectual development, right, and its cultural development. I mean, 1,000 years may be about all you get, right, or 50. In other words, and I think that maybe to a certain extent, it's capitalism that keeps it unnaturally alive for much longer than it should, right? I mean, because capitalism is so adept and adroit at absorbing whatever cultural development occurs, right? Everything except for capitalism, it gets destroyed by this fragmentation, right? And in that sense, I almost wonder whether sort of capitalism, what it does when a civilization reaches its end, is it sort of turns it into a kind of a zombie, right? That just sort of keeps walking around, but I mean, it's empty, right? I mean, and I could claim some interesting connection to the fascination in the West with zombie narratives, right? With zombie films and zombie games and stuff. Because there is a sort of sense that we're all still walking around, but we died a long time ago. And that constant sense that, the best days are in the past. And I mean, even my daughter's generation, I mean, when I was 16 years old, I never for 1 second thought, oh gosh, it was better to be young in 1950, right? But pretty much my entire daughter's generation thinks, they lament the fact that they weren't teens when I was, right? And so I wonder, is this simply the end does the end of the narrative mean really the end of the civilization? And what has to happen then is that new narratives have to be created by up-and-coming civilizations. And secondly, do you think that capitalism kind of unnaturally extends the life of these things?
The kind of capitalism we have now is, investment capital, finance capitalism is actually historically new. So we're going to have to watch and see what
we don't know where it's going to go. Is what? Yeah. As
far as the first question is concerned, having been raised at the ends of a modernist culture and having participated in that narrative, we're conditioned, I think, somehow to think of civilization as an ongoing work in progress. We forget that if we look over the course of civilizations across the world, a lot of them just went into stagnation for centuries. They did nothing new, no innovation, no new poetry, no new buildings. They just went to work, went home, went to sleep. That was it. And if they were fortunate, meaning if there was no natural crisis, like I said, this could go on for centuries.
Yeah.
And this, right now the world is in upheaval in a number of ways, and we have a real problem in terms of how the West is going to deal with Islam. And I'm not an Islamophobe, but I don't mean that. What I mean is that Islamic states, only 3 Islamic states, as far as I know, ever had to go through modernity. Turkey, Iran, and Egypt. No other Islamic state has gone through modernity, and you can see from those 3 examples of the countries that did, that it's possible to regress in some ways. So the problem there is that a lot of what we talk about, even talking about here in terms of what is modernism, what is postmodernism, all assume the Enlightenment, right? An Enlightenment that hasn't happened in Islam. That means that coming to cultural understandings between East and West right now have only occurred after the colonial era. Have only occurred because of capitalism. It's only money that allows a conversation between, say, Saudi Arabia and France, or the United States, as we know.
Yeah.
So it's not sure right now how long we can remain stagnant, but that we are stagnant, I believe. I firmly believe that we have, that we're intellectually exhausted in the West, and we have reached a moment of stagnation. And stagnation just goes on. It's just, it isn't that you can't write books. Let's make this clear about postmodernity and post-art, going back to Dante, or even post-politics. It's not that you can't do things. You can't do art. You can't write books. You can't engage in politics. That's not what it's about. You can do all these things. You're just not going to innovate. There's not really going to be anything new that's going to be interesting and useful and progressive.
You can make the stuff, but it simply isn't going to play the role that such things used to play. I mean, in other words, because it's no longer part of a single story, and there's no longer essentially a single audience. It's literally millions of audiences broken up into tiny pieces. And I guess really the question that we just don't know the answer to is whether civilizations can, in a sense, completely renew from a postmodern period, from an extended period of stagnation, can sort of be reborn like the phoenix, or whether basically each civilization gets one run at it. And so the next great narratives are going to come out of the civilizations that are currently developing, right? So that's sub-Saharan Africa, India, China, which huge portions of it are completely, undeveloped. Compare the coastal cities to the hinterland, and that, the West is simply is not going to go. We're not going to go around again, right? I mean, you get to go around once, and we had a very long run, and we're now kind of exhausted, and it's really only just money that's keeping it afloat. But as soon as these hungrier, newer, younger, developing civilizations really come into their own and their own narratives really get started, I'm assuming the capital is just going to flow over there, right? Is what it seems like to me. And with the declining birth rates in the West and all of that, it does seem like there is a kind of you get a single narrational arc. And once the postmodern hits, you're kind of done. And then it's just a matter of how long you can stay in the done state. How long you can keep walking around after you're dead, right?
That is possible. I mean, you would need some sort of major infusion. I don't know that you can innovate within a stagnant culture. That I don't think is possible. You can get innovation from without. Chinese culture was stagnant for a long time at one point, and then suddenly the Buddhists came in, and Chinese philosophy ramped up again because suddenly they had to account for something new.
Yeah.
So and maybe that's what will happen. Maybe these younger cultures that you're talking about will introduce some new idea, and we'll get all excited about it here. I don't know.
That's actually a good argument for maximally porous immigration, especially from developing nations, because what you could say is, look, what's going to inject new life into the American civilization is people from South America, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what's going to inject new life. It's not going to be us, right? And I think that you can make a case. I mean, I tend towards pretty open immigration myself for precisely this reason, despite the fact that I understand that I do think there's a serious problem. Some of the worst manifestations of our politics come out of the sort of the dislocation of the lower and lower middle parts of the economic ladder. The people basically who are now, the people voting for Trump from these places that are sort of deindustrialized. I do think that there is a strong case to be made that if you want a civilization like this that is at the end of its rope to renew, it's going to have to come from an injection of people from places that have not yet been through the narrative, right? It'll be interesting to see how that all goes. Are you hopeful, or I mean, I know you're not generally temperamentally hopeful, but intellectually, do you think the Western civilization will renew? Or do you think eventually this will just run out and all the action is going to be happening in other places, so to speak?
Gosh,
you don't have to guess if you don't want to. I'm just,
because it's America we'll have to see if we can survive Donald Trump. First of all, we're not even sure we'll do that. As far as Europe is concerned, it has obviously its own remarkable problems right now. Intellectually, I think we're going to have to find some way to rethink the function of science in society, because science is was central to the modernist narrative. Science, I think, is at this point also pretty much exhausted. I mean, string theory is the end of physics. If physics has a history, string theory is the end of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
So we'll have to rethink the nature, how science relates to the society around us. We long thought it had its best use was that it produced technology. Technology does not depend on science anymore. Technological engineers don't need science anymore. But I think science as an intellectual pursuit, I think could be renewed if it rethinks how it relates to the society around it. So we'll have to see. I mean, likely, it's hard to say because I was actually 10 years ago. If you asked me that question, I'd say, this is going to be the Chinese century. Xi Jinping has taken enormous back steps, and I don't know if that's true anymore.
Yeah,
they're having problems.
What's going on in Hong Kong right now is it's unfolding right in front of us. I mean, it's that could be, in my view, the biggest mistake he will have made, and in hindsight, that may turn out to have been what blew it right for them. But we'll have to see. I don't know why. For some reason, I think. I don't know. I think that these futures are going to come out of Latin America and out of India, but I couldn't give you a good argument. It's sort of instinctive. Anyway, this is really incredibly interesting, and I want to thank you so much for. You're the only sort of person I could have this sort of conversation with, just because of the vast territory it covers, and the fact that you and I share one common thing, I think, and that is a very broad array of interests. And so I really want to thank you, John, and I look forward to seeing you here again sometime soon.
Okay, I really enjoyed this conversation. This was fun. It was really fun.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, take care.
Have a good night.